Guna Caves Incident. On 3rd September 2006, 9 friends from Kerala arrived at the Guna Caves in Kodaikanal. Locals called them the Devil's Kitchen and refused to visit after dark. By 2006, 13 people had fallen into the caves and never come out. Hidden holes dropped over 100 feet straight down into darkness. The 9 friends called themselves the Manjirul Boys. Saju David was 26 and the leader. Subhash Chandran was 19 and the youngest. They saw a broken fence and a warning sign in Tamil they couldn't read, so they went in. While exploring, they suddenly realized Subhash had vanished. Where he had been standing was a hole about 3 feet across. They shined phone lights into it but saw only blackness. Police arrived hours later with fire department officials. Then they heard a faint cry from deep below. Subhash was alive. He had fallen, but his belt caught on a rock edge, stopping his fall. Officials estimated he'd fallen at least 120 feet down. The officer told David that rescue attempts always failed here. Firemen tried from the surface, but Subhash had lost consciousness. David decided he would go in himself. Police protested, but David was determined. At 4 p.m., David tied a rope around his waist and descended. The hole was barely wide enough with slick, moss-covered walls. At 60 feet down, hundreds of disturbed bats forced him to turn off his flashlight. The first rope ran out, so friends tied another. At 120 feet down, David's flashlight found Subhash on a narrow ledge. His body was twisted and bloody but breathing. David tied the rope around Subhash's torso. The ascent took another hour with rope scraping against rocks. At one point, they got stuck, but David freed it. When they emerged 6 hours after the fall, a cheer went up. Subhash was rushed to the hospital unconscious but alive. David collapsed with shredded hands. Subhash became the first person in history to fall into Guna Caves and survive. In 2008, Saju David received India's Civilian Award for Bravery. Shelter Cave Incident. In September 1985, 5 young people decided to camp in a shelter cave near the Platte River in Nebraska. Michael Wiles was 12 years old. His older brother Mark was 18. Their friend David Funkhauser was 17. 2 other youths were also in the group. Shelter caves are natural rock overhangs that provide protection from weather. They arrived in the late afternoon with camping gear. As evening approached and temperature dropped, they built a campfire near the cave mouth. Eventually, all 5 settled into sleeping bags beneath the rock overhang. The campfire provided warmth, and they felt safe. But they had created a deadly combination without knowing it. Groundwater had been seeping through the rock layers, gradually weakening the structure. The campfire heat made it worse. When rock heats, it expands. When it cools, it contracts. This created stress along existing cracks. Together, groundwater and fire heat were compromising the ceiling above them. But there was no visible warning. Without any warning, a massive slab of cave ceiling suddenly collapsed. Tons of rock came crashing down on the sleeping campers. The collapse happened with devastating speed. Michael Wiles was crushed instantly beneath the falling debris. His brother Mark died in the same instant. David Funkhauser also died beneath the falling rock. The 2 other youths somehow escaped being crushed. They survived but were in complete shock. They tried desperately to dig through the rubble, but the weight was too heavy for 2 teenagers to move. The survivors made their way out to seek help. When rescue workers arrived, they found a devastating scene. Recovery required heavy equipment to lift the collapsed slab. The investigation identified groundwater seepage and campfire heat as the causes. The combination had weakened the rock and triggered the collapse. Marbo Cave Incident. On the 25th of July 2015, Senior Airman Drew Belair prepared for a weekend adventure. He was 20 years old from Iowa, deployed to Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. The temperature was 89 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air felt thick and oppressive. Drew's friends had told him about Marbo Cave's legendary freshwater pools. They described it as a swimming paradise. The entrance lay hidden beneath ancient trees with a steep descent. At the bottom, the cave system revealed crystal clear water. The main pool was about 100 feet across. Beneath the surface, darker openings led to underwater passages. After the brutal heat above, the cool water felt like paradise. Drew's friends were swimming through underwater passages between different sections. Drew had always been a strong swimmer. He spotted an entrance to a cave about 8 feet below the surface. His friends had mentioned chambers with air pockets where you could rest. Drew took several deep breaths and dove down. The underwater world was beautiful with blue-green light. He entered the opening and the limestone walls closed around him. But something was wrong. The passage continued much longer than expected. It curved and branched in unexpected ways. Drew's chest tightened as his air supply ran low. There was no sign of an air pocket ahead. Panic set in. He had entered a different section than his friends described. Drew tried to turn around, but the tunnel was barely wider than his shoulders. His movements became frantic. The return felt like swimming through molasses. His vision narrowed with dark spots. On the surface, his friends noticed his absence and grew alarmed. They dove repeatedly searching for him. But Marbo's cave system was vast with dozens of passages. Without proper diving equipment, their search was limited. Deep in the maze, Drew's strength failed. His brain struggled to maintain direction. His body began to shut down from a lack of oxygen. One friend scrambled up to call emergency services, but help was many minutes away in the remote jungle location. By the time rescue divers arrived with scuba equipment, it was too late. They found Drew about 40 feet from the main entrance. He was trapped in a section with no air pocket and no escape. Little River Spring Cave Incident. On February 16, 2002, two experienced cave divers entered Little River Spring in Florida for a routine dive. Pete Reagan was 55 years old with over 300 logged cave dives under his belt. Frank Murphy, 43, was also an experienced cave diver and Reagan's diving partner. Little River Spring was part of Florida's underwater cave systems that snake through limestone bedrock. These weren't typical scuba diving spots, but serious cave diving territory for experts only. Reagan and Murphy were diving with a group of friends at the spring that day. The plan was straightforward: explore deeper passages and return before air supplies ran low. The group descended into the cave system and began their underwater exploration. The visibility was excellent, water temperature comfortable, and everything went according to plan. They planned to dive to the dome room, a large chamber deep within the cave system, but as they approached the area, the dive leader made a conservative decision. He called for the group to turn around before reaching the dome room. This followed proper safety protocols by leaving plenty of air for the exit. As the group began their exit, two divers made a side trip to Harper Tunnel. This left Pete Reagan and Frank Murphy to continue toward the entrance together. Murphy took the lead position with Reagan following behind him. Murphy was swimming steadily toward the entrance, following the main passage back. The dive was going perfectly with plenty of air and good visibility. About 500 feet from the entrance, Murphy realized something was terribly wrong. He looked back to check on Reagan and discovered his partner wasn't behind him. In cave diving, losing sight of your partner is extremely dangerous. Murphy immediately turned back upstream to look for Reagan. What he found about 40 feet behind him was the stuff of nightmares. Pete Reagan was in full-body convulsions, completely unconscious and unresponsive. Murphy was 500 feet inside an underwater cave with a partner having seizures. Reagan's entire body was convulsing violently while underwater. Murphy's training kicked in, and he swam to Reagan's aid immediately. He managed to get Reagan's regulator back into his mouth. But when Murphy checked Reagan's breathing, he wasn't breathing at all. Murphy began forced ventilation using Reagan's regulator to force air into his lungs. This was incredibly difficult to perform underwater in a confined cave passage. Murphy was performing artificial respiration while swimming to keep them both alive. The forced ventilation seemed to work initially as Reagan began breathing intermittently, but the breathing kept stopping, forcing Murphy to repeatedly perform the procedure. Murphy tried to tow Reagan's unconscious body back toward the cave entrance. He was performing life-saving medical procedures while navigating tight underwater passages. Murphy's own air supply was being rapidly depleted from the rescue effort. About 30 feet before the entrance, Murphy ran out of air completely. In a desperate move, Murphy switched to Reagan's air supply. Both divers were now dependent on a single air source to survive. Murphy continued towing Reagan while breathing from his partner's regulator. Somehow, Murphy managed to reach the cave entrance with Reagan still alive. As they emerged into the spring pool, other divers sprang into action. They pulled Reagan from the water and began CPR immediately. The scene was chaotic but organized with multiple people performing chest compressions. When paramedics arrived, they took over resuscitation efforts and transported Reagan. Northfield Cave Incident. On the night of November 1st, 1986, 5 college students decided to dig into a sealed cave near their campus. The caves near Northfield, Minnesota, were part of limestone cave systems in the upper Midwest. St. Olaf College sits in Northfield, where caves had become a local attraction for adventurous students. But the particular cave in this story had been deliberately sealed 8 years earlier. Local authorities had filled the entrance with dirt and debris to prevent people from entering. When caves get sealed, it's usually because they're unstable or too dangerous. On this Saturday night, 5 students from St. Olaf College decided to ignore the sealed entrance. These weren't experienced cave explorers, but college kids looking for adventure. The group included Thomas E. Johnson, a 20-year-old student excited for the exploration. The students arrived at the sealed entrance with only flashlights. They found it completely blocked with dirt, rocks, and debris. A smart group would have realized this wasn't a place they should enter, but these 5 students decided to dig using bare hands and a single pail. They began tunneling through the sealed entrance in cramped conditions. They were digging through unstable fill material that had been deliberately placed there. The students worked for hours, taking turns crawling into their makeshift tunnel. As the night wore on, they managed to tunnel about 15 feet through the entrance, but every handful of dirt they removed made their tunnel more unstable. The loose fill material above was held up only by the material below. At around midnight, after hours of digging, the inevitable happened. The fill material above their tunnel collapsed suddenly and catastrophically. One moment Thomas Johnson was inside working, the next tons of earth crashed down. The weight was enormous, like several dump truck loads of dirt and debris. 3 other students just inside the entrance weren't completely buried but were caught. They found themselves trapped with their friend Thomas under tons of earth ahead. The 5th student who was outside remained completely free and able to help. The panic was immediate and overwhelming for everyone involved. The students partially trapped were screaming for Thomas and and trying to dig. The student outside immediately understood this was beyond what they could handle. He ran to get help, knowing his friend was buried alive. When emergency services received the call, they immediately dispatched rescue teams. Professional rescue workers arrived with proper equipment to locate Thomas, but they had to work carefully to avoid triggering another collapse. The other 3 students were extracted relatively quickly, but were in shock. The rescue workers had to guess Thomas's location and begin removing debris. Working in the dark and cramped conditions, the rescue team began digging. They knew they were racing against time to save Thomas. At approximately 1:30 a.m., rescue workers finally located Thomas Johnson's body. Trapdoor Cave Incident. On Thanksgiving weekend 1981, 16 people entered Trapdoor Cave in Indiana for a routine caving expedition. Trapdoor Cave sits near Bloomington in Monroe County, Indiana. The cave gets its name from the narrow, restrictive entrance that acts like a trap door. The group included 10 experienced cavers, 4 members from Michigan Interlakes Grotto, and 2 complete novices. On Saturday morning, they entered with all their equipment, including headlamps, ropes, and extra batteries. They spent about 2 hours underground exploring various passages and chambers. Everything went perfectly during their exploration with stable weather above ground. The cave was in good condition and the group worked well together. They took their time enjoying formations and documenting several passages, but caves are dynamic environments that can change without warning. Rock formations, stable for decades, can suddenly shift due to various factors. As the group began their exit, they moved through the entrance passage in single file. 2 members had already cleared the entrance completely and were safely outside. Glenn Anders, an experienced member, was almost to the entrance when disaster struck. Without any warning, the wall of the stream gully at the entrance completely collapsed. The collapse was catastrophic and instantaneous with no creaking or rumbling. 3 massive rocks, each weighing 1,400 pounds, broke free and crashed down. The huge stones slammed directly on top of Glenn Anders. 1 rock hit his left shoulder with crushing force, while 2 others pinned his head. Anders drew his legs up toward his chest in a natural defensive reaction. This probably saved his life, but put him in an incredibly compromised position. With his legs drawn up and torso pinned, he could barely expand his chest to breathe. Every breath was a struggle as the weight slowly crushed his body. The 14 others behind Anders found themselves trapped in complete darkness. The narrow passage that was their only way out was now blocked by tons of rock. Don Maxwell, just behind Anders, could hear him struggling to breathe nearby. Maxwell tried to help Anders extend his legs to relieve chest pressure. Outside the cave, a medical student was at the entrance when the collapse occurred. He immediately squeezed through gaps in the collapsed entrance to reach Anders. Working in darkness with limited space, he loosened Anders's chin strap. He conducted a quick examination and found Anders conscious and responsive. The medical student felt a depressed area on Anders's shoulder, indicating possible fractures. Anders's compromised breathing was the most immediate concern. The 2 members who had exited safely ran to call emergency rescue services. They knew conventional equipment might not move rocks weighing over 1,400 pounds each. The 14 trapped spelunkers retreated to an upper-level room to regroup. Being sealed underground with no obvious way out created enormous psychological impact. Rescue personnel arrived and set up a block and tackle system. This mechanical advantage system would allow them to move extremely heavy objects. The rescue team's first priority was removing the smallest of the 3 rocks. The operation was painstakingly slow and dangerous to avoid disturbing larger rocks. Any shift could crush Anders completely or cause additional rocks to fall. The medical student continued monitoring Anders's vital signs and breathing. After hours of careful work, they successfully removed the smallest rock. This provided some breathing relief, but Anders was still pinned under 2 larger stones. After a few more hours, they removed enough rocks to free Glenn Anders. He was carefully extracted and immediately transported to the hospital.